Welcome, everybody. This is Fast Talk, your source for the science of, and I'm going to say today, science.
Science?
Not sure we're going to talk too much about performance today, so let's just talk about this is the science of science today.
Science.
So, Rob, what are we talking about?
Science.
Yes, we are. Which means I'm happy. You're just trying to get through with your cookie and coffee.
Yeah, I will say we are talking about metabolism, but for the past 10 minutes, Trevor has been staring intently at me dipping a chocolate chip cookie into a latte.
You said yourself you are basically a 12-year-old.
No, I said I'm a 42-year-old, 12-year-old.
Yes.
The funny part is on the last dip, the cookie broke in half and I lost half my cookie is now at the bottom of my latte.
He's got a very soggy cookie.
I know.
And hopefully we'll hit it at a good point in the show and be able to enjoy this. Coaches, we have exciting news. Now you can get certified in the polarized training method. Fast Talk Labs has collaborated with USA Triathlon to provide the first ever polarized training certification from a U.S. Olympic Federation. This course includes an in-depth look at the 80-20 training method with extensive contributions for Dr. Steven Seiler, myself, Trevor Connor, physiologist Alan Cousins, triathlon coach Ryan Bolton, and my Fast Talk podcast co-host Rob Pickels. Complete the Polarized Training Certification course and you can become one of the first Polarized Training certified coaches in the world. Take advantage of the excitement surrounding the 80-20 training method in this 2024 Olympic year. Learn more at triathlonlearning.com. Just search for Polarized Training Certification.
Metabolism, Trevor, this is a big topic.
Yeah, so last time we did one of these basics episodes, we tried to talk about oxygen delivery, which was ridiculous to try to cover in an hour. So we thought, what is an even bigger topic to very inappropriately summarize in an hour? And we thought metabolism.
Well, it's a basic episode, not a shorts episode.
That's a good point.
Right?
So we are going to, and look, I'm going to give a big qualifier to start here. They do whole courses on this. As a matter of fact, my major when I was doing my master's was bioenergetics, which is the study of this. So I spent 2 years studying this. To try to get this into an hour, anybody listening who has a background in this, yeah, we're going to butcher it. We're going to kind of take this apart. We're going to get it down to very simple terms.
We're going to take the meat off the bone, like a butcher.
Right. There you go. I like it.
I made that one up on the spot.
Our goal here is not to teach you the details of the biochemistry, which I had to remind myself last night because as I was going through oxidative phosphorylation, I started doing the calculations of how much ATP do you get from X number of hydrogen ions and all that sort of stuff, and suddenly went, why am I doing this? This used to be on my tests, and I don't have to do this anymore. So I just want to clarify, we're not going to dive deep into the biochemistry. What we are trying to do here is just give you some basic understanding. So if your coach starts talking to you about these things, if you hear something about this on the rides, somebody mentions ATP or glycolysis, which we do a lot on the show.
Or oxidative phosphorylation.
Yes, which we're going to say a bunch today.
Let's be honest, everyone. Trevor can't help himself. I'm here to provide
Rob's going to protect you.
Translations for you. To simplify things down to normal words that people can understand.
Rob's going to protect you from me. So let's start. I'm going to start with kind of a hot take. And Rob, I'm hoping you're going to disagree with me. But since this is an episode about metabolism, we got to define metabolism. And this is something that drives me nuts because people talk about metabolism. You see commercials, particularly late night commercials. This is going to ramp up your metabolism. And people talk about, oh, I'm getting older. My metabolism slows down. Most people don't know what metabolism is. And so here's going to be my hot take. I even looked this up last night and found plenty of places that define metabolism one way, plenty of places that define metabolism another way. So there's even debate on exactly what the definition is. But probably the most common definition is metabolism is just the sum total of all the chemical reactions in your body. But I was a bioenergetics major. And bioenergetics, if you look up at that definition, it is the subset of the chemical reactions that relates to the transfer of energy. But when I was taking my classes, because it was a bioenergetics course, we had a bias and felt that really that is metabolism. Metabolism is about the sum total of energy transfer in your body, of using energy and producing. You don't produce energy, breaks the laws of physics, but you know what I mean.
I concur.
So there is that debate there. Is it all chemical reactions or is it just chemical reactions that are related to energy? But here's the thing. In our bodies, the way we use energy is with chemical reactions. So think about like a steam engine, the old trains. They got their energy by producing heat. So they just tapped into heat energy. We can't do that in our bodies. If we tried to tap into heat energy, so you released heat and then use that heat to power the various processes in our bodies, we'd basically cook our bodies. So we can't do that. So we need to use a different type of energy. The energy we use in our bodies is by the breaking of chemical bonds. So you have a molecule that has a lot of stored energy in it. And particularly, we're going to talk in a second about ATP, which releases a phosphate, and that releases a ton of energy. And then that energy gets collected and used for the different processes in our body. So the human machine is all about chemical energy.
Yeah. And, sometimes we expend some energy to store some energy, right? And that's the creation and the breaking of bonds. And, it's kind of like maybe we take some electricity from the wall, right? And it takes energy to put that into a battery, but then that battery is electricity in storage form, and we can drain the energy out of that when we need to use the energy later on for some other process. That's what we're talking about inside of the body today, is the creation and the storage of energy, and then ultimately the release of that energy so that we can do work, so that we can live, so that we can run, so we can breathe.
So here's my hot take, and Rob, I was hoping you were going to kind of argue with this, is metabolism is defined as the chemical reactions in our body. Since we use chemical energy and most reactions either use energy or release energy, really metabolism is mostly the study of energy, or it's about energy.
I concur.
Wow. Okay. I wasn't expecting that. So,
well, yeah, I don't know. If you want to simplify it down that much, then yeah. If we're talking in a reductionist situation, then energy and the processes that go into creating, storing, and utilizing it. That is metabolism.
We're going to talk more about reduction and oxidization. And this is where you smack me. So here's my thing. I get frustrated when people talk about, well, my metabolism is slowing down. It's like this magical thing that happens as we get older. Really what you're saying is, I'm just burning less energy because you're sitting on a couch. Yes, when you're a kid and you're growing, you need to use a lot of energy just in the process of growing. If you're on the couch, you are burning more energy as a kid because your body's doing things. As an adult, when you sit on the couch, you're not burning as much energy, but there's no magical thing of my metabolism, my energy burning slows down. You're just being less active. Go out for a long bike ride, you just sped up your metabolism. So I hate the term, my metabolism is slowing down, I'm speeding up my metabolism. It's just you're burning less or more energy. You want to speed up your metabolism, just go do more work, walk more, exercise more.
Yeah, and I think that this is one of the difficulties when words get used in common parlance, in everyday language, that can mean multiple things, right? I think in this situation, when people are saying their metabolism is slowing down, what they could be saying is that their metabolic rate is slowing down, right? And well, okay, there are reasons that might be happening. Like Trevor is saying, you could be less active. Maybe you have less muscle mass because you're getting older. Your testosterone is decreasing, your muscle mass is decreasing because you're not lifting weights, things of that nature, then sure. But metabolism itself as a process is not necessarily changing inside of your body.
So get away from this magical view of metabolism of it's something you had when you're a kid and you don't have now.
Yeah.
You can ramp it right back up, and it's pretty easy to do if you want to. So I think two other terms that we need to define here. One is calories. Calories is very simple. It's a measure of energy.
Yeah. And you know how they figure that out? By burning things.
Yes.
Go figure.
So what is the technical definition of a calorie? Let's see if you remember this.
It's the amount of energy, a small c calorie is the amount of energy it takes to raise 1 cubic centimeter of water, which is 1 gram of water, by 1 degree Celsius.
Nice.
And it's 4.18 and some other numbers, joules.
You remember that pretty well. I'm impressed.
Well, might not be a huge biochemistry person, but I am into energy and the amount of calories you need to complete big giant bike rides. So I do a lot with this. Now, what's interesting is when we talk about calories, we do not talk about calories. The calories that we talk about are actually 1,000 times bigger
Big C.
than that calorie. A big C
Or a
calorie or a
K-cal.
K-cal. Exactly. And I love online, because I don't know, I post on like Slow Twitch or whatever else, and I'm always making that distinction. And I think that it drives people crazy.
Yeah, but it's an important distinction.
It's
'cause
huge.
people
Well, when you're doing
intermix them.
calculations, it's huge, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then the last really important thing to understand is, so let's see if I can remember this off of the top of my head, adenosine triphosphate.
ATP, yes.
ATP is the energy currency in our body. So you think about carbohydrates, fats, we consume those. That gives us our energy. But nowhere in the body are you directly taking the energy from carbohydrates or fats and using them to power anything, to move your muscles, to keep your heart beating, anything like that.
Yeah, this chocolate chip cookie in my latte is not plugging into my muscle and helping me run.
So what actually happens is those fuel sources are broken down, the energy is released from them, and then the energy is trapped and used to create ATP. And then that ATP, we store a very small amount of ATP in our body, so we're constantly reproducing it. So basically, you have ADP, adenosine diphosphate, and then you have a phosphate group that are floating around. You release energy. So let's say you consume a bunch of glucose. That glucose, and we'll explain how in a second, is processed. It releases energy. That energy is used to bind that phosphate to the ADP to produce ATP. And that's constantly, even when you're sitting on the couch, happening in your body. And then when your muscles need to work, when anything needs to happen in your body that requires energy, it basically grabs an ATP, releases the phosphate from the ATP, that releases the energy, and then that energy is used directly.
Right. And so in this situation that Trevor is describing, ATP, going back, that's adenosine triphosphate. So we have an adenosine molecule that's sort of the backbone, and then tri stands for 3. We have 3 phosphate groups attached to that. When Trevor mentioned ADP, D as in dog, D as in doorknob, D as in delta, I think is the right word, then that stands for 2. It's an adenosine with 2 phosphates on it. And there's also an AMP, a mono, a 1 phosphate adenosine as well.
Yep. So I think an easy visual to think of this as is ATP is your body's battery. So you want to power anything in your house, got to plug a battery into it. So that's the ATP. Glucose, fat, all these fuels that you consume, their job is to charge the battery. They're not the battery themselves. They just charge the battery. They keep your batteries charged up so that you can power the various things in your body. That's the way to think of it.
Sure is.
Does that work? You haven't argued with a thing yet.
I know.
You're just bummed about your cookie and your coffee.
My cookie-laden latte hasn't kicked in yet.
There we go. Any other things that we need to cover to give terminology? And that ATP one is really important because that is the direct fuel of our body. So last thing to understand here of how important this is and how much we have to keep rebuilding this ATP. We don't store a lot of ATP or ADP in our body because it's actually molecularly very heavy. So we don't want a ton of it. So at any given time, we have about 4 ounces of ATP/ADP in our body. It's not a lot. If you ran a marathon, you would produce about 80 kilograms of ATP. And it's not that you're bringing in new ADP or new ATP. It's just you're constantly having this cycle of ATP releases the phosphate, becomes ADP and a phosphate, and then we recharge it, bind them back together, and then they're used again. So it's just this constant cycle. But as you're running, as you're working out, as you're going for a bike ride, you're just constantly rebinding to produce the ATP and then binding to release the energy for whatever process. It just happens over and over and over again.
Right. And to put that into real world terms, if you just from a standing stop sprint at maximum speed and you only relied on the ATP stores that you have in your body, you do nothing to replace them, you don't start metabolism to recharge these batteries, you have less than 2 seconds worth of ATP energy stored in your body at maximal effort. And if you were just going at a base sort of a zone 2 effort, then you have about 15 seconds worth of ATP stored in your body. So immediately we have to be starting this metabolic process to begin recharging those batteries. They need like lithium ion technology, man. We have moved on. Like we have good battery storage now.
So going with that battery analogy is basically like you have batteries that last 10 seconds.
Lame.
So you got to kind of be charging them as you're using them.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about ATP and how we have a very short storage of ATP that we can use immediately. I think before we dive into our primary fuels of glucose and fat, there is one other short form. Again, it doesn't last very long, but it can provide you with very immediate energy and only lasts, again, it's measured in seconds, and that's phosphocreatine.
I spent a lot of time as a high school sprinter going to GNC and taking creatine. It's just what you do.
It's because you were told to do it.
That's what you do. Yeah. So what the heck does that do? Well, the creatine molecule is bound to phosphates. And as you know, we've been talking about these phosphates. Well, in our body, there's a very simple process to replace one of the phosphates onto ATP, to make ATP useful again for our muscles and maintaining cell membrane potentials, all of that. And that is literally to steal one of the phosphates off of creatine and add it back to ATP. It's a two-step process, which is very fast. But as we've realized in the theme of this episode, right, the fastest processes seem to have the least amount of storage. And that's the same with the creatine that we have in our body. We all have creatine naturally in our body, but through supplementing exogenous creatine, drinking that 5 grams of creatine with your carbohydrate, then you're able to put some more of that storage. It's like eating little batteries, if you want to think of it that way, maybe a little safer. Tastes bitter, just like batteries do anyway. Then you can have a little bit more of that storage in your body. And we talked before that the ATP that we have is maybe just a couple seconds worth of storage. By adding more creatine phosphate, we get a couple more seconds worth of storage, right? So if you're doing a 100 meter, 200 meter, maybe a 400 meter dash, you get a few more seconds before the rest of your metabolism has to kick in. And maybe this is or isn't beneficial for endurance athletes who are going for hours. There's certainly some research that says it's beneficial. There's some that say it's not. That is not the point of this episode. What you need to know from this is that this is a very fast system that only lasts for a couple seconds at a time.
It's a one-step process.
You got it, baby.
So, so we were talking about the prioritization here. If you're going off the gun super fast, you're initially relying on that stored ATP.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that's going to ramp up the quickest is this phosphocreatine system.
Correct.
That's going to continue to produce energy while you're ramping up the other systems.
Yep.
So it is an important one. And, I'm glad you brought back up the phosphate. I just want to take a quick second to just emphasize that what biology has discovered or evolution has discovered is this phosphate bond that takes energy to bind. But when that bond is broken, it releases a lot of energy. So it's just a great way of storing energy and releasing energy. So you'll hear physiologists talk all the time about phosphorylation, and this is what they're talking about.
There you go. Now, one thing to point out before we move on here is, let's be honest, the vast majority of research has been on male subjects. And while the process is the same between men and women, right? The breakdown of carbohydrate and the chemical process that causes, the phosphate to be added back to create ATP. While that is the same between sexes, we do have to recognize that when we look at the output of metabolism, it is a little bit different in men and women, right? Because women have different levels of hemoglobin, different levels of muscle mass, different enzyme concentrations, so on and so forth. So we have been talking about kind of a female-specific episode. Hopefully we get that out at some point in the near future. This is a very generalized conversation, and there really needs to be more research and more education on the female-specific side of things.
That's a good segue to what we're about to talk about, because one thing that we do know for certain is women are better at using fat to recharge their ATP.
Correct.
And men have a little better ability to use glucose.
For the same relative workload, females, for the most part, as generalizations can be, are going to be oxidizing more fat than a male is at that same relative workload.
Yep. So let's shift gears there and let's talk about our primary fuels. And again, even though these are the fuels, remember, we don't directly use fat, carbohydrates, or protein to power anything. All they are being used for is producing ATP. That is it. And there's a loss of efficiency when you do this. So, for example, with carbohydrates, if you look at the stored energy in a glucose molecule, only 34% of it actually goes into the ATP.
Okay.
So it's not 100% efficient, not even close.
No.
Fat's a little more efficient. Fat's 40%. But another way to look at this is, so for example, if you take a mole of glucose, you're still not smacking me down for using these terms.
That's fine. I'll tell them what a mole is later.
Yeah, don't worry about a mole. Moles are confusing. But we'll just talk about a mole of glucose. If you take a mole of glucose, so if you actually burn that mole of glucose, you would produce about 630 kilojoules.
I suddenly want avocados.
Why avocado?
Somebody out there,
like Swedish fish or something like that.
No. Somebody out there is going to get that joke, and it's going to be really funny to the one person on the internet who understood what I just said.
Yeah, I didn't get that.
That's okay.
I'm not even
going to explain it to you.
So, but if you take a mole of glucose.
Avocados.
Oh, boy. We're not going to get past this, are we?
No, we're not.
I'm just going to pound through. So about 630 kilojoules. When that glucose is fully oxidized, the equivalent energy that goes into ATP is only about 200 and something kilojoules.
Sure.
So that's what we mean by loss of efficiency. So that other 400 kilojoules is lost as heat.
Sure is. Stinks, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does stink.
Man.
And this is why you get hot when you work out.
I know. Anyway, so fat.
Yeah, so let's go through our fuel sources. Want to start with fat?
I want to start with fat, but I want you to start and I'll tag on.
Okay. Fat. It is our largest energy source.
Might be your largest energy source.
Oh, boy. Says the guy who's eating a cookie and a coffee. So fat is our most efficient energy source.
It's our most abundant.
It is definitely our most abundant. So let's just for a minute kind of compare carbohydrates and fat here. If you take the different types of fat molecules, and they're all going to produce different amounts of ATP. But you take a single triglyceride, hesitated there was single because triglyceride, as the name says, is actually a glycerol bound to three fatty acids. So it's actually three.
That's right.
But you can produce over 400 ATP from triglyceride. You take a glucose molecule and you only get 32 ATP.
That's it.
So this is a big debate if you want to get really science geeky. Some people say 34, some people say 36. I go with the 32 because, well, you do actually produce, I think it's 36 ATP. You have to use 4 ATP to produce it. So the net is 32.
Got to spend money to make money, Trevor.
Exactly. So we're looking at what you have total at the end. So this single molecule of fat produces significantly more ATP than the single molecule of glucose.
Sure does.
And the other thing is glucose is heavy. Again, you can't store that much without putting on a lot of body weight because we store it as glycogen, and a single glucose molecule has to be bound to 4 molecules of water. So you just can't store that much. So as a result, we store, I think it's about 2,000 calories in our body of glycogen, of glucose.
Yeah, it's roughly, depending on the gender, the size of the person, it's roughly 400 calories in your liver. Liver glycogen is interesting because it can be sent anywhere in the body. It can hit the bloodstream, with the balance of that being between 1,200 and 1,600 calories in your muscles, right? So that really depends on the amount of muscle mass you have, is how much glycogen you're storing in your muscles. But what's really interesting about that, and I don't want to get too far off topic, is that once it's in your muscle, it is stuck in your muscle.
Yeah.
So if you're out riding your bike, all that glycogen in your tricep is doing nothing to help you pedal your bike. So whenever we're doing calculations on, say, how much energy you ought to be consuming during an event, we have to limit it to the amount of glycogen that you have in the working muscles, because that's all that really matters.
Right. So the way to think of it is you have enough glycogen. If you were running a marathon, it wouldn't even get you through a full marathon.
No, absolutely not.
Get you maybe a little over an hour because you're not going full, you're going below threshold.
Yep.
But it won't get you through a marathon. So now let's talk about fat, and let's stick with a lean athlete, because obviously people are really going to vary. But you have somewhere in the neighborhood of about 100,000 calories
Right.
in fat. So you have enough, even a lean marathon runner has enough fat to power them through about 40 marathons.
Yeah. And this fat is stored in a few different places, right? We have the subcutaneous fat that we all think about. When you pinch your belly, you get a nice little handful of fat there. We also have some fat around our organs. Maybe that's not touched as much for fueling exercise.
Yep.
And then we also have some fat stored in our muscles itself called intramuscle triglycerides as well that can potentially be a fuel source for people.
Yep, exactly. So it is our primary fuel, and relatively speaking, it's light. We can store a lot of fat. If you tried to store 100,000 calories in glucose, you wouldn't be able to walk. You'd measure your weight in tons.
If I ate that much, I wouldn't want to walk. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's a good point too. So it's a great fuel source, but here's the issue. Fat is slow burning.
It's hard to break down giant molecules.
It is hard to break down. Plus, you don't store very much in the muscles.
Mm-hmm.
It has to be transported. And because fats and water don't really like one another,
mm-hmm.
it's actually very hard to transport the fats to the working muscles. There's a whole bunch of processes that we're not going to go into too deeply today.
You stopped. Are you okay?
Yeah, I wanted to say albumin, but I'm not going to say it.
Oh, it's fine. You can say albumin. I'm losing a little bit of albumin right now. So
Yeah,
my
that's fair, and I'm
kidneys
sorry
are
to hear that.
struggling. It's all right.
So you're glucose dependent right now.
Why not, man? Why not?
Yeah.
Let's just eat cookies and lattes all day.
But I think we actually covered this in one of our science episodes.
What?
One of our review episodes where we talked a little bit about all the steps to get fat into the working muscles and how difficult it is.
Maybe. I don't quite remember. I think it's interesting that lipolysis, the breaking down of fat, can actually exceed the transport
Yep.
and the oxidation of fat. So the issue isn't breaking the fat down for energy. It's actually taking those molecules and utilizing them.
So I always feel like we should shift, before we finish talking about fat, we should shift to carbohydrates
Let's do it.
and talk about how quickly those can be broken down.
Quite.
And that's really your benefit of carbohydrates. Fats, unlimited, but it is very complex on the processes it takes to finally produce your ATP from fat. So you can go forever on fat, you just can't go fast.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Glucose is different. And so here's another hot take. And Rob, one of my favorite old textbooks is the McArdle Catch book.
Mm-hmm.
And I was going back through, so actually one of their newer editions, I think the 9th edition, I don't know if that's the newest or not, but I was reading that last night and they started talking about aerobic and anaerobic glycolysis. And I started grinding my teeth because I hate those terms.
Sure.
And I was so appreciative after they explained that. They said, and we kind of feel those terms aren't appropriate.
Mm-hmm.
And we'd rather use slow and fast glycolysis.
Okay.
And I was like, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for switching the terms.
Yeah.
So we're going to get to this in a minute, but when you are breaking down these fuels to produce ATP, in every cell, you have processes that break it down. And the anaerobic side is your glycolysis, which only works on carbohydrates.
Mm-hmm.
Then that happens outside of the mitochondria. So it just happens in what's called the cytosol, the regular fluid of the cell.
The swimming pool. Yeah.
The swimming pool.
Mm-hmm.
Then you have your mitochondria. And inside the mitochondria, you have the Krebs cycle and oxidative phosphorylation. And that's where aerobic metabolism happens. And that's where you continue to break down glucose and you also break down fats.
Mm-hmm. That's like Uncle Bob floating in the pool noodle.
Yes.
Yes.
And so here's the thing. Glycolysis is really fast. It's just 10 steps.
Mm-hmm.
So you can produce ATP from glycolysis really quickly.
Correct.
But you can only produce it from glucose. And it is anaerobic. It requires no oxygen.
Yes.
At no point in glycolysis do you need oxygen molecules. But you take a glucose molecule and you break it down in glycolysis, you're producing 2 ATP.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a lot.
Nope.
So it's fast, but it doesn't give you a ton of energy.
Yep. And it actually takes 2 ATP. It produces 4 ATP, but it took 2 ATP.
Right.
So that's where you get to Trevor's net 2 ATP. And when we're talking fast, we're talking this is able to be activated in milliseconds.
Yes.
And you can see the end product of glycolysis, which is lactate. You can see lactate begin to accumulate within 1 second of the onset of workload.
Yep. So if you were doing a 100-meter sprint, the first few steps, you're relying on the stored ATP.
Yep.
By the end of that sprint, you are relying on glycolysis.
Yes. I read this. I'm jumping ahead a little bit. The last 5 seconds of a 30-second all-out sprint are 50% aerobically fueled by that point. Interesting.
Even glycolysis can't keep up,
Yep.
and very quickly you hit a point where aerobic metabolism ramps up, and you're using a lot of energy from aerobic metabolism. But we've talked about this in a show, and as we go through this and talk about these various processes, really important to understand is you're not exclusively using one.
Correct. Never.
Ever. I think the closest would be like if you're doing a sprint, that first step or two might be almost completely stored ATP while you just ramp up the processes.
Functionally, the contribution is stored ATP, but you are initiating all processes,
right?
Aerobic, anaerobic, if you want to call them that, from that first step. Your body's flipping all the switches. Just some of these systems take a little bit longer to warm up and get going than others. And so their contribution kicks in later.
Exactly. But you are always using a mix of all of them.
Yep.
So that's the fast part of glucose breakdown.
Yep.
Then I will explain all this in a minute. The end product of glycolysis, which is pyruvate or lactate.
If you talk to Inigo San Milan, it's always lactate.
Which I agree with.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm going with what a lot of people like to say. Yes, because it has to be converted to lactate in order to go into the mitochondria, and then it gets converted back to pyruvate.
Yep.
But that then moves into the mitochondria, goes into what we're going to explain in a minute, the Krebs cycle and oxidative phosphorylation.
Yep.
And then you produce another 30 ATP.
Mm-hmm.
It just takes longer.
Mm-hmm. Sure does.
And that's the slow phase.
And to put that into perspective, we're talking a 1 to 2 minute ramp up, right? And we see this. You can see this in your heart rate. You can see this in your oxygen consumption if you've ever had like a VO2 max test. When we change workload, when we go from 200 watts to 225 watts, that initial bump in our ability to produce 225 watts, the initial energy needed is supplied by the fast glycolysis. And you can watch the oxygen ramp up second by second for another minute or two until it flatlines and remains relatively steady. That's the lag period that the slower glycolysis needs to work aerobically.
Yep. So the other interesting thing here to understand about carbohydrates or glucose, it is the only fuel that can produce ATP both anaerobically
Without oxygen.
And aerobically.
With oxygen.
Right. Fat can only produce ATP aerobically.
Mm-hmm.
So protein, well,
who cares about protein?
Yeah, there's some amino acids, I guess, they don't go into glycolysis, but they are converted to, as I remember, to pyruvate.
Mm-hmm. I don't think we should get into it. Just like I don't think we should get into other sources of energy like alcohol.
Oh.
Come on, man. I don't want to do it. I don't.
How about coffee?
I don't. Coffee is a different type of energy. Also, there's ketones. And I don't want to get into that today because we did an amazing episode with Brendan Egan. I don't remember, 30 episodes ago, 40 episodes maybe at this point. Really great explainer on ketones, how they're utilized for energy and whether or not supplemental ketones, exogenous ketones are worthwhile. So go check that out if you're interested in ketones.
So I'm going to give just 1 minute on protein. I think we just need to cover it quickly and then say from this point forward, we're really just going to talk about carbohydrates and fats.
You do you. I'm going to drink my cookie.
Please do. Protein is a fuel source, but our body doesn't like to use it as fuel. Amino acids have much more important roles as functional roles in our body, so both structural and as messengers. So our body prefers to use them for those purposes. Even when it breaks protein down for fuel, gets them into the Krebs cycle, it's hard work. It takes a lot of energy because there's a nitrogen bound to proteins. That's part of what defines a protein or an amino acid. And you have to do something with that nitrogen when you break it down. So what you will see is when we start becoming depleted in glucose, our body might start converting, so it's called gluconeogenesis, converting some amino acids to glucose to keep the steady supply going. But it really doesn't like doing that because it takes energy and you have to process those nitrogens. So it's only going to do that when it has to.
And that's what you might see, but what you might smell is ammonia. So if you've ever been out on a ride where you haven't appropriately fueled, or it's a really long ride and you're not bringing enough food, and you're like, man, I kind of smell like Windex.
Yes.
That's ammonia, right? Well, this is why. And so, hey, people, make sure you're eating enough carbohydrate.
Yep. Means you haven't been fueling correctly. So last thing I'm going to say on the different fuel sources is there's what's called oxidative priority. So when you consume a mix of these, your body is going to prioritize which it breaks down first, which it breaks down second, which it breaks down third. And the priority goes carbohydrates, then fat, then protein. Now, there's debate of whether alcohol is a carbohydrate or its own fuel, but it definitely is highest in the oxidative priority. So what that means is if you consume a mixed meal, you're going to use those carbohydrates for fuel. And if that's supplying your needs, it's going to take all that fat and say, well, we don't need this right now because we're fueling off of the carbohydrates. So we'll just store the fat. So, people eat a meal and go, oh, I'm converting all these carbs to fat. You can convert. I don't know if we'll go into this today or not, but the inner conversion is actually not very good in the body. So actually what's happening is you're just prioritizing using carbohydrates and you're storing the fats you consume. So it kind of looks like you're converting, but you're not really. Does that make sense?
Yes.
I got a thumbs up from Rob. Have you ever given me a thumbs up before?
No.
Are you ever going to give me one again?
No.
Just that one time.
Yes.
All right. So now let's go into the hard part where I'm going to be biting my lip not to give.
No, man, go for it. Go for it. I'll bring the people back to reality. It's fine. You do you.
Okay, fair enough. We just talked about our fuel sources. So now we're going to talk, and we've already mentioned it a little bit, about, for lack of a better word, the factory, the place where those fuel sources are taken, broken down, and used to produce ATP. So we already talked a little bit about glycolysis, Krebs cycle, oxidative phosphorylation. You've probably heard these terms. You might have studied them in high school chemistry. If you're a exercise physiologist listening to this show, then you've studied it to death and wondering why you're listening to this episode. But we're going to give you the basics of what you need to know about these.
Well, Trevor, should we move to more glycolysis?
So let's explain these. And there is one other thing that we need to quickly explain, and I'm going to see if I can do this with an analogy. It's kind of fun. All this is driven by enzymes.
Okay.
And I'm sure people have heard the term enzyme. And what are enzymes? So this goes back to, this is why the body doesn't like to use protein for fuel, because enzymes are just proteins.
They are proteins.
And enzymes, I think the correct term would be speed up processes. So I got to use an analogy here that could kind of be fun to try to explain enzymes as simply as possible. So if you're in a factory and you have a nut and a bolt and you put them on the floor, if you think of that analogy as the factory as the body, strangely enough, you leave that nut and the bolt on the floor long enough, the nut will screw itself onto the bolt.
If you put enough monkeys in a room, they will write Shakespeare eventually.
Yes. But here's the weird thing. So when you're talking about binding chemicals together, if you put them in the same chemical milieu together for long enough, they will eventually bind together and they will eventually break apart. That happens on its own. It just happens really slowly. So it's like I said, it's this weird thing that if you just put the nut and the bolt on the floor, eventually that nut's going to screw onto the bolt at some point, and it might screw itself off at some point. Think of an enzyme as a little factory worker who comes in, picks up the nut and bolt, and just screws them together. Makes it happen much more quickly.
I see where you're going with this.
Don't like the analogy?
I don't know that I like the analogy, but that
was pretty good.
The most important point that you've made that we haven't pointed out is that these processes are just kind of happening as they float around in the cytosol, right? That as long as we have enough of piece number one and enough of piece number two, they eventually bump into each other with the help of an enzyme and the process happens. It's not like this is a orderly sort of thing that's occurring.
Right. But that was the important thing I always learned about enzymes is the enzyme isn't making a reaction happen that wouldn't happen otherwise. It's just dramatically speeding up the reaction. So you have these two chemicals, use that example, that are just floating around this milieu. as I said, at some point they might bind together, but the enzyme literally kind of grabs one, grabs the other and goes, I'm going to put you together and I'm going to make it happen really quickly. Still struggling with that, aren't you? I can just see the look on your face.
It's not wrong. Anyway, move on.
This goes back to we're trying to put this in simple terms, Rob.
Moving on.
Okay, we're moving on. So the important thing is every step in these processes that we're going to talk about has a enzyme that is involved in that step, an enzyme that makes that step happen.
Yep.
And that becomes really important because if you don't have an availability of a particular enzyme, that's going to affect how quickly this can happen. So every process has what's called a rate-limiting enzyme. So glucose, the rate-limiting enzyme, is something called phosphofructose kinase. So PFK. The availability of PFK is going to determine how quickly glycolysis happens. And just something really important from a health standpoint, it does control the breakdown of glucose. It doesn't control the breakdown of fructose because fructose enters glycolysis right below PFK. So when you process fructose, you are processing it very rapidly, whether you need it or not.
Do it.
So that's great when you're exercising because you get rapid fuel. If you're sitting on the couch eating a lot of high fructose corn syrup, it's not a good thing. Not a good thing because the body doesn't know what to do with it. So,
I agree.
Do you want to correct me on enzymes? What's your analogy? What would you use?
I'm good. I don't need to spend more time on it.
I went from a thumbs up from Rob to he's got his head at his hand.
I'm complacent at this point.
He's
He broke me.
Trevor, you ruined this episode. I'm done with it. Okay. So, shall we talk about glycolysis?
Do it.
Glycolysis has 10 steps. It's in the cytosol. Look, I'm going to tell you, when I took my first physiology class, I remember going into my final exam, and one of the questions was, what part of the cell does glycolysis happen in? And it had like the cytosol, mitochondria. It had a bunch of different locations. And I remember reading that question going, that's such a nitpicky question. Why would we care? And as I learned more and more about physiology, I'm like, that's a really important question. Because glycolysis, we want it to be quick. And as we're going to talk about in a second, getting things into the mitochondria is hard. Getting things out of the mitochondria is hard. That slows things down. So it's really important that glycolysis happens out in the cytosol so that you can not only produce the ATP quickly, but the ATP can get to the parts of the cell that need to use it really quickly too.
Mm-hmm.
So that's actually kind of important. So it's a 10-step process. It doesn't use oxygen, so it's anaerobic. Doesn't produce a lot of ATP. As we said, breakdown of a glucose molecule in glycolysis only produces a net total of 2 ATP.
Mm-hmm.
What else do we need to say about glycolysis?
Well, Trevor, you've talked about enzymes. You talked about the fact that glycolysis actually consumes ATP. And I just want to point out the reason that glycolysis consumes ATP is because those enzymes actually need some energy to activate themselves to do the work that they have to do, right? So I'm just trying to tie those two concepts together for people. And we can't go back on those steps. Once those steps have occurred, it's not like we can back up to the molecule that we had before in the breakdown, the conversion of a glucose molecule into ultimately a pyruvate or a lactate, or actually I should say 2 pyruvates or 2 lactates from each glucose molecule.
Though it is important to point out, most of glycolysis can reverse, and that's actually how we produce glycogen.
Correct. Different enzymes, though, to go backward than enzymes to go forward.
Right. But one other important thing on that note to be aware of is, as you pointed out, it takes ATP to get it moving. Right, the first 2 steps, you need ATP to actually use ATP to break down glucose before it starts producing ATP. Glycogen enters the process right below that first step. You only have to burn 1 ATP to break down glycogen.
Sure.
So when you are getting the fuel from glycogen, you actually produce 3 ATP. When you're getting it from glucose, you've only produced 2.
There you go.
So another advantage to be producing glycogen when you're at rest.
Well, Trevor, let's take this from a glycolytic process to an oxidative process. But still, let's talk about carbohydrate.
Yes. So now we're getting into the mitochondria. Should we talk about what those are?
Mitochondria?
I think they're cool.
I think you're going to compare it to a powerhouse, a factory, a energy plant,
No,
and Uncle Bob floating in a pool in a pool noodle thing.
that's so 1990s. I'm going to go cooler. I'm going to go evolutionary biologist on this.
Wow. Okay.
The theory here is that
Oh, you're going there.
I'm going there.
Oh, God, he's going there.
Original cells, eukaryotic cells, were anaerobic.
Yep.
They couldn't use oxygen for fuel.
Correct.
And the belief is that bacteria were the first things to figure out how to produce energy using oxygen.
Mm-hmm.
And at some point, bacteria got inside a eukaryotic cell and said, hey, we kind of like being together. Let's keep doing this. Symbiosis. And that bacteria eventually evolved into mitochondria, which is why mitochondria actually has some of its own DNA.
Yep. Interestingly, too, if we want to switch this to genetics, your mitochondria come from your mom, which is fortunate for my kids because Melissa, my wife, great distance runner, me not so much. So, they stand a chance moving forward.
Yes. So if you are a great aerobic athlete, thank your mom.
Thanks, Mom.
If you are a horrible aerobic athlete, blame your mom.
Thanks, Mom.
Dad had nothing to do with it. So, yes. So mitochondria has some of its own DNA, but here's another, and I'm going to simplify a little bit, but really important thing to understand about mitochondria is that's where your aerobic metabolism happens. So you've heard about antioxidants and oxidants. It's called oxidants because oxygen is a very powerful oxidant. It can do a lot of damage to your body.
Mm-hmm.
So when you are producing energy aerobically, you're producing a whole lot of oxidative stress. And your body needs to learn how to deal with this. And one of the ways you do it, if you look at mitochondria, it actually has an inner membrane and an outer membrane, and it really kind of keeps the whole system locked up. So you have very low pHs there. It's very acidic environments between the two membranes. You have a lot of oxidative stress to deal with in there, but it keeps it mostly in the mitochondria, which helps protect the rest of the cell.
Mm-hmm.
And that's important because if you were trying to do these processes in the cytosol of the cell, you could really damage the cell. And this is part of why this aerobic metabolism is so slow, because think of mitochondria like a Fort Knox. It doesn't allow much to get transported in. It doesn't allow much to be transported out. And you got two membranes to cross and a really acidic environment between those two membranes. So it takes a lot of work to actually move things in, move the fuel into the mitochondria. And once you produce the ATP, it actually takes work to get the ATP out. You actually have to use ATP to pump the ATP out.
Right. And that's also why one of the primary adaptations to endurance training is to create more of these mitochondria, right? Because it can be very limiting in terms of energy production. And, primarily to produce more energy this way, you need more of mitochondria as opposed to, say, making the mitochondria itself more efficient.
Yep. So going back to our battery analogy, I want to see if I can just make Rob quit for the day. Think of glycolysis as you got this shady guy sitting outside the factory selling these tiny little batteries.
Just tell me he has a trench coat and he opens it up to reveal batteries.
He does.
Yes. I think I saw that guy on Pearl Street earlier.
They're not very good batteries. They don't give you a lot of energy, but you can get that battery from them quick.
Yeah, you can.
Inside the factory, you got these really big, nice batteries. But you've got to go through a security check. You have to do all this work to get in there. You have to sign a lot of paperwork to buy the battery. And then you have to go through security again to get out before you can finally go and use your battery. So that's kind of the difference between aerobic metabolism and anaerobic. Big batteries, unlimited battery source. Just takes a lot of work to be able to use it.
Slightly off topic, funny story. One time I was going onto the U.S. Army's Environmental Research Lab, onto that Army base in Natick, Massachusetts, and they do a full, thorough searching of your car. You drive over a pit with a guy, in the ground, and he's looking underneath. And Trevor, as you're explaining to this, it brought back really bad memories because I mistakenly, and you can tell this was a long time ago, I mistakenly had a disposable camera like in the door pocket of my car, and I got grilled. So people, security at some places can be real tight, just so you know.
Did I ever tell you about my story about going to nationals at the U.S. Air Force Base?
No, but yeah.
This was 2019. They had Masters Nationals at the Air Force Base
in
down
Colorado
just
Springs.
outside of Colorado Springs. I had just moved to Colorado, so I still had my Canadian driver's license.
Mm-hmm.
And the base was on lockdown because there had been a shooting that week, and I didn't know any of this. So I show up to get to nationals. I go to the northern security gate.
The Canadian security gate, the north one.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay.
That's not the way they saw it. He asked me for my ID, and I give him my Canadian driver's license. Like, we're not allowing foreign nationals in. And I'm like, I'm American. And he goes, prove it.
Yeah, right.
I'm like, I'm in the middle of Colorado. Why would I bring my passport?
Yeah.
So he wouldn't let me in.
Yeah.
And I was like dejected because I'm like, I'm going to have to miss nationals.
That's the worst reason to lose a race.
It was absolutely a horrible reason. So I'm starting to drive back to Boulder, and then I have a thought, there's a southern gate.
Oh, God.
Let's try this differently. So I turn around, I go and park at a Safeway parking lot,
Okay.
get kitted up, get on my bike, and I bike to the southern gate.
Okay. And they're just looking for people from Mexico. So.
Right. Or Canada. Those horrible Canadians. And she asked me for ID, and I'm like, I didn't know that I needed ID. Like, my race is about to start. I just got you. I just came from my hotel.
Oh my
gave
God.
this whole sob story. And I'm like, but my race is about to start. And like, I thought you'd know that nationals is going on. And like, I was doing my best to look like I was going to cry.
Oh my God.
She let me in.
Oh my God.
She let me in. And I got to the race as they were like doing the announcements and getting, so I'm like pinning up my number as they're counting down the start.
Wow, Trevor, there's a black SUV pulling up outside. I wonder if you're going to be arrested for infiltrating a American naval, or not naval, Air Force base.
That was my thought the whole race. I'm like, am I going to get arrested by the end of this race?
Motivation to ride fast. Anyway, back on topic.
Yeah, what are we talking about?
Krebs cycle.
Krebs cycle.
Or the citric acid cycle, if you want to call it that.
Or do you know the other name for it?
The tricarboxylic acid cycle.
There you go. Well done.
I know.
It has a lot of names.
It sure does.
It has a whole lot of names. So before we can fully explain the Krebs cycle, we need to talk about the end of glycolysis. As you said, so you break down a glucose molecule, you end up with technically 2-pyruvate. But I agree with Dr. Samalan. It's really lactate. Because pyruvate, we were just talking about the security of the mitochondria. Pyruvate can't cross the mitochondrial membranes.
Mm-hmm.
So it has to be converted to lactate in order to go across the mitochondrial membrane. Then, once it's inside the inner part of the mitochondria, it gets converted back to pyruvate.
Mm-hmm.
And pyruvate then gets converted to acetyl-CoA. Or, I'm waiting for you to jump on for all these, oxaloacetate, which I can't pronounce.
That's fine. You can't pronounce any of these words because you're Canadian, but I'm not calling you out on it, even though I want to.
That is fair. Now, look, we're not going to go into all these steps. You can look this up. Just do a search for Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle, and you'll find all sorts of pictures of it. It's multiple steps, but it's a big loop because it always circles back around to oxaloacetate.
Mm-hmm. And I just want to point out, as we're talking about like, oh, well, it's pyruvate, no, it's lactate. They're the same molecule. Lactate just technically has like a hydrogen bound to it that eventually, two hydrogens that eventually basically just dissociate off anyway. Yeah. So whenever we're talking about these molecules, we're really not talking about things that are like totally different, like a pickup versus a passenger sedan. We're talking about a passenger sedan that has a flag on the back of it.
Yep. But that's actually important where you say it's just a pyruvate with 2 hydrogen ions bound to it. Because as we'll talk about in a second with the electron transport chain, this is all about producing hydrogen ions. So it's actually a benefit that you're pulling hydrogen ions into the mitochondria. So that's another role. So not only is lactate beneficial in being able to cross that membrane, but it's bringing 2 hydrogen ions in with it, which is important. And then they get released. So take a look at this cycle. It's complex. But here's the really interesting thing about it. This whole complex process only produces 1 ATP.
Mm-hmm.
That's not the role of the Krebs cycle.
Nope.
What the Krebs cycle does, and this is where finally Rob is going to jump on me, is it is reducing NAD and FAD.
That works.
Damn it.
I don't want to get into it. I want to pick my battles. This is a long episode, man. When Trevor says reducing, he's just talking about like one chemical reaction creating another chemical reaction so we can move from one molecule to another.
Wow, thank you.
That's simple.
So we haven't even talked about this, NAD and FAD.
Oh, God.
They are very, very important molecules here. They bind to hydrogen.
Mm-hmm.
So when you reduce NAD, what you end up with is NADH.
Correct.
Plus a hydrogen ion.
Yes.
When you reduce FAD, you end up with FADH2.
Yes.
And that's really important. They are carriers of electrons. So when we're talking about binding that hydrogen ion or a molecule to it, what we're really talking about is it's now carrying the electron that comes with that hydrogen.
Yes.
So this is very, very important. We talked about how your body has to constantly be converting ADP back to ATP, and then the phosphate gets released, you release energy, and then becomes ADP again in that cycle.
Yes.
You have the same thing with NAD and NADH and FAD and FADH2, where you have a limited supply of both of those, and you need to be constantly reducing and oxidizing them, which is binding the hydrogen to them and then unbinding the hydrogen.
Yes.
And that's when you are working really hard and all of a sudden you feel like, hey, I'm kind of burning up here and I can't keep going. You're feeling that burn. One of the big things that's happening is you're getting a buildup of NADH and you don't have sufficient NAD.
Correct.
Because we didn't even talk about this, but in glycolysis, it does reduce 2 NADs.
And we need to make sure that we have NAD to continue that process, right? If we run out of, kind of think about like NAD is a bucket. And if you're trying to dig a hole and you got nowhere to put that dirt, you have no bucket to put that dirt in to move it away, then you got to stop digging your hole, right? And that's why we oftentimes talk about the interconversion of pyruvate and lactate in glycolysis is it creates more NAD buckets, essentially.
Right. So, glycolysis basically stops when you have too much NADH and not enough NAD.
And there's some acidic sort of processes in there as well. But ultimately, that's like the rate limiting of glycolysis, not necessarily how quickly we can break down glucose or a glycogen. Right. It's just this process itself can be rate limiting because of the components that you need, the tools that you need during it.
Glycolysis produces hydrogens. And so when people talk about acid at its simplest form is just hydrogen ions. You don't want a lot of hydrogen ions floating around in your cells. So if you're ramping up glucose and there isn't NAD to take up those hydrogens, your cells basically say, got to stop here. Mm-hmm. Can't have that acid buildup. And that's, again, as you said, one of the beneficial roles of lactate. Lactate can take 2 of those hydrogens. So it'll take them from NADH and produce more NAD. So lactate actually is beneficial. It's not a waste product.
Man, Trevor, you're getting really deep here. I think we should move on because I want to talk about alpha ketoglutarate on dehydrogenase.
You're just looking these up.
I am.
So this is the part, though, of the episode I was scared of because I know that we just lost a whole bunch of people talking about NAD and FAD. But really important to understand that basically we're about to talk about oxidative phosphorylation. And that uses electrons and hydrogen. And NAD and FAD are the carriers. And without those carriers, everything breaks down. And so Krebs cycle, really its primary role is to bind hydrogen to NAD and FAD.
So in this whole process of utilizing glucose, and actually we're at the Krebs cycle, so we can talk about fat at this point.
Yes.
Right? Because fat enters the Krebs cycle as an acetyl-CoA. The whole point of trying to take these substrate molecules, fat, carbohydrate, and turn them into ATP, the Krebs cycle is just a middle sort of step in an otherwise sort of 3-part show.
Yep. And where glucose, I forget how many hydrogens get broken off of glucose and then pulled into oxidative phosphorylation, but it's not a lot. But when you're breaking down a fat molecule, depending on the size of the fat molecule, you can release basically 40 plus hydrogens, which gives it a lot of potential to produce a lot of ATP. Mm-hmm. But for now, I think the last thing to just emphasize with the Krebs cycle is it is this huge complex process. We already talked about all the difficulty of pulling in the fuel into the mitochondria, that takes work. And same thing with fat. It's got to be transported in. And then all of it gets broken down to acetyl CoA, and then it goes through this very complex process, and you're still producing almost no ATP. All you're doing is binding hydrogen to NAD and FAD.
But don't worry, that ATP is coming.
It is coming. So where is it coming? What happens next?
I don't know. I want you to tell me.
Rob, you've been so helpful this episode.
I'm here to learn. I'm not here to be helpful. I'm here to tell the people what you're saying. So you got to say something so I can tell them what it means.
So the next process is the electron transport chain.
Or as you previously called it, oxidative phosphorylation, because you were trying to make it sound special.
Right. So as I said, phosphorylation is when you bind a phosphate to ADP. And because oxygen is used, it is oxidative phosphorylation. And basically, so I also mentioned the electron transport chain, and this is where I'm going to try to explain this as simply as possible. In fact, not only am I going to keep this simple, I'm really not going to explain the electron transport chain. If you really wanted to understand this, I mean, this would be in an exercise physiology class, several classes to explain how this whole process works. So really all we're going to cover here is just not how it works, but some of the things that are good to understand, so that when somebody's talking about this, you just have some sense of what this is about and why this is important to our physiology. So you have these complexes that are on the inner membrane of the mitochondria. So remember, there's an outer membrane and an inner membrane, and that in between is this highly acidic space, and there's a reason for that.
We'll call that purgatory.
Yes. Basically what you're doing is you're taking all those hydrogen ions and you're dumping them into that space. And remember, hydrogen is acid. So you have this huge concentration of hydrogen ions in between these two membranes. But then what happens? So interesting thing is to produce a concentration gradient like that, where you have on one side of the membrane very high concentration of hydrogen ions, on the other side you have a very low concentration. That gradient actually has energy potential.
So this goes back to the concept of we have to at times use some energy to make more energy, right? And so what we're doing when we're taking the hydrogens off of that NADH that we created, because we use some energy in the Krebs cycle to make NAD plus into NADH, when we separated that hydrogen and also the electron that goes with it, as Trevor said, off of NADH, we're using that energy to build up, kind of a pool of hydrogens that when we pull the plug,
right,
and that hydrogens begin to flow through the membrane, we can use that to do work.
Yep. And I love that you talked about pulling the plug, because that was exactly the analogy that McCardle used.
Really?
Think of it like a waterfall powering a turbine.
Yeah, exactly.
So you basically, that inner membrane, think of it like a dam.
Mm-hmm.
And these complexes, these cytochrome complexes, are the actual dam that can release. So if you think of it like water, it every once in a while releases the water, and that powers the turbine.
Yep.
So what happens is these complex, they take the electron,
yep,
and transport the electron, allow the hydrogen to come out of that inner space. That releases energy. And then that energy is used to bind a phosphate to ADP and produce your ATP.
Holy crap. We made an ATP finally.
We finally made an ATP.
My God, we've been talking for an hour and 15 minutes and we've made an ATP, people.
This is the point that we're trying to make, is this aerobic metabolism produce a lot of ATP, but boy, does it take a lot of work to get there.
Lord.
And so here's the really fascinating. So 4 of these complexes, so they can produce a fair amount of ATP. So every time that an electron gets transported, understand the electron kind of gets moved from one complex to the next.
It gets handed off, yeah.
Right. So 3 hydrogen ions get transported, but only 1 electron gets transported. At the very end of this, it's got to do something with that electron.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where oxygen comes in.
Mm-hmm.
The oxygen takes up the electron, binds to 2 hydrogens, and you end up with water.
Yay.
So we talk about aerobic metabolism, but oxygen is only used in the very, very, very last step to dispose of an electron.
Yeah. It's also interesting to me too, it's to create water. It is interesting to me how water enters and exits at a few different places throughout metabolism. And I don't know that people realize that it is ultimately essential to creating energy. And granted, I don't know that we would ever end up in a point where we're so dehydrated that metabolism stops for that reason, but it is critical to making sure the process continues.
Right. And so the two end products of all this are water, H2O,
Yep.
which your body can then use, and CO2.
Correct.
And here's the thing. If CO2 starts collecting, once again, this whole process backs up. You have to get rid of it to keep the process moving.
And it makes sense that these are the end products, right? Because we're breaking down molecules, right? Like glucose is 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens, right? All that we're doing is we're starting with carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and that's what we're ending up with. They're just ending up in different forms, carbon dioxide and water,
Right.
CO2 and H2O.
Right. But the thing I wanted to emphasize is the buildup of carbon dioxide, because how do you get rid of carbon dioxide?
Breathe harder.
You breathe harder. Now, you can use bicarbonate to buffer it to a degree.
Well, bicarbonate is HCO3. Anyway, I don't want to go down that road.
Yeah, fair enough. We don't have to go down that road. But basically, you have to get rid of that CO2. So when you're breathing hard, everybody thinks, oh, I'm breathing hard to bring in that oxygen.
Yep.
That's true. You need to get the oxygen so that you can keep powering this. But actually, what's more of a rate limiter is how much CO2 you can expel.
And oftentimes our drive for breathing is based on the amount of carbon dioxide that we have in our bloodstream. That's what's causing us to hyperventilate or breathe faster.
Yep, exactly.
Yep.
All right, so here's where I'm going to nerd out a little bit, because there is a complex 4 that gets talked about a lot, because complex 4 can be leaky, meaning it just releases electrons and the electrons are not used at all to produce ATP. That makes us less efficient. We're not 100% efficient here. And you have seen one adaptation when we go to altitude is we actually start producing a different complex 4 that is less leaky. So I wouldn't say all, but many more of the electrons are used to produce ATP. It's not that you necessarily have better oxygen delivery. It's just you're being more efficient with the oxygen and electrons you have available to you.
Sure. And for quick explanation, these complexes that Trevor were talking about, they're little protein pods in the membrane where these reactions are occurring. So just some different spots that are very specialized in terms of the reactions that they are helping to complete. So the details of each one, not necessarily important beyond the scope of this episode. But when he talks about complex 4, it is just one of those proteins that's in the membrane.
So, Rob, what do you think? Have we covered it?
I mean, yes and no, to tell you the truth. There's, so much more information out there. We can only do so much justice to it in an episode like this. And I wish that we could be whiteboarding and diagramming and drawing funny little pool pictures and everything else. But I think that we kind of covered it in a very linear fashion from start to finish.
Yeah. I'm going to say any exercise physiologist listening to this going, oh my God, you just butchered this or that. Yeah, absolutely. We're just trying to give basic understanding so that when we talk about it on the show or when you hear other people talk about it, you just have a sense of what we're talking about. It'd actually be easier to go into all the terminology, use all the chemical names to explain this. This is one of those things where trying to get it down to something very simple is hard to do.
And I want to touch on the fact that we ultimately just talked about a molecule of glucose so that we were talking about a little bit more of a simple, singular process from start to finish. But as I made mention earlier, fat goes through initially a process called beta oxidation, which I can say is akin to glycolysis. It's really not, but ultimately it is preparing that fat molecule to enter into the Krebs cycle. And that's where those two pathways between a carbohydrate and a fat, that's where those two pathways converge and ultimately are relatively the same thereafter.
Yep. But I think if there's just important messages to get out of this, the couple takeaways I have are, first of all, understand these fuels, where they are our source of energy, they are not directly used to power anything.
Correct.
They are only used to produce ATP.
Yep.
And then the ATP is our energy currency. It is what powers everything in our bodies.
That's what powers connecting and disconnecting our
Yep.
muscle fibers during a contraction. That's what powers the pumps that keep ions on the correct side of the membrane.
So all these metabolic processes that we're talking about have one purpose, just to produce ATP, to take our fuels, break it down, release their energy, and use that to produce ATP. And it's not 100% efficient. It's 34 to 40% efficient, which is pretty interesting. So the rest is lost as heat. But I think the other important message to understand here is there are several processes here. And the simple one, I'm going to skip over phosphocreatine, I think we covered that, is glycolysis. That's our one true anaerobic process that can only use carbohydrates. It is fast. It is outside of the mitochondria. So it's just quick 10 steps. And then the ATP is immediately available. It just doesn't produce a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Something that I think is always worthwhile in pointing out is it's not like we say, oh, I'm going to go for a 2-hour run or bike ride today. My body knows I'm going to do a 2-hour run, and therefore it should use the aerobic processes. We very much are turning on all of our systems right away, and we are choosing systems ultimately by the intensity or the need to produce energy to sustain that workload. So it's not like we have this like very intelligent, forward-thinking situation when we're out riding or running and we got to go up a steeper hill. You know what? You're going to have to tap into that anaerobic energy production to provide energy in the short term to ramp that up. Now, if you hold that new workload for a little while, then your aerobic system, it kind of has time to get itself moving up to producing more energy, and it can begin to take over more of the workload down the line. We're always using all of these systems at all times. When we say we're doing aerobic work, it's not like it's only aerobic energy production that's happening.
Yep. It actually, that brings up a really important point that we forgot to mention, which is there's an expression that fat burns on a carbohydrate flame. And here's the reason why. We talked about the Krebs cycle.
Yep.
The first step of the Krebs cycle is that oxaloacetate. Can you please say it for me?
Oxaloacetate?
Thank you.
Yeah.
What he said. We are constantly breaking that down, so we need more. Pyruvate can be converted into
Oxaloacetate?
Thank you.
Well, hold on. You're saying acetyl-CoA.
No.
Whoa.
Oxaloacetate.
Well, oxaloacetate is the last step, and
Okay,
then
fair enough.
pyruvate comes in, or acetyl-CoA comes in.
So it is a step before acetyl-CoA comes
Correct.
in.
Yes.
Fat
So if you
gets
want to call that
converted-
the first step,
Yeah.
it's a round chart, people. The first and the last can kind of be the same.
Yeah, there is no true first step. But here's the point. So the reason I'm saying it's the first step is it is the step before acetyl-CoA.
Keep going.
I
You got
am
it. You got
killing
it. You got
myself
it. You got
here.
it. You got it.
It is the first step before acetyl-CoA enters. Fat can be converted into acetyl-CoA. Pyruvate can be converted into acetyl-CoA. Only pyruvate can be converted into oxaloacetate. So we need a steady supply of glucose going through glycolysis and providing that pyruvate to keep replenishing the oxaloacetate. Without it, the Krebs cycle is going to shut down. So you can't run the Krebs cycle just on fat.
Correct. Because if you run out of, or if you don't have enough of the last step, which is then used to create the first step, then the first step never happens.
Right.
Yes.
We got there.
Eventually. In a very roundabout Krebs cycle-y way.
So the simple explanation for that is there's an expression, fat burns on a carbohydrate flame. If you are not keeping glycolysis running, Krebs cycle can't run.
And if the Krebs cycle can't run, then you can't run.
Right. Or you can run just for only a few seconds.
Yeah, I know. Then you got to lay down.
So the last message that I just want to convey to everybody is that aerobic process inside of the mitochondria is extraordinarily complex. Not just the number of steps in the Krebs cycle, but we talked about that, tons of steps. It doesn't really produce any ATP, just one. It's just reducing NAD. Then that goes into that electron transport chain. That's an incredibly complex, slow-moving process. But on top of that, there's then these two membranes of the mitochondria, and things have to be transported in, things have to be transported out. That's also very difficult. So while you could produce a ton of ATP with this aerobic machinery, it's just slow.
Yeah, and hey, this just popped in my head. It's kind of like, let's say you're a line cook, Trevor. You do so much prep work before you ever make a meal, right? The meal, the steak that you cook is what you get paid for. That's what earns you the ATP. Yep. But you got to get everything prepped. You got to cut your vegetables. You got to be, butchering your meat and all of that. And that takes so much time. That's like the Krebs cycle. It's all the work you do to get ready to do the work that actually gets you paid. Bam.
Like the analogy.
Yes.
I like my shady guy with the overcoat and batteries a little bit better. But
don't buy batteries from that guy. Come on, people. just trust me on this one.
All right. Shall we leave it there, Rob?
Let's leave it there, Trevor.
I hope everybody enjoyed that. I hope we didn't lose all of you.
And a final note, I want everybody to know that I never actually got to a soggy cookie. I think it totally dissolved into the coffee. I drank my cookie.
Did it taste good?
That's hard to say. It was a little much. That was another episode of Fast Talk. Subscribe to Fast Talk wherever you prefer to find your favorite podcasts. Be sure to leave us a rating and a review. The thoughts and opinions expressed on Fast Talk are those of the individual, especially Trevor and his terrible, terrible analogies. As always, we love your feedback.
That's even worse.
I know. No, it's not bad. It's just different. And I don't fault you for it, even though I love to make fun of you, because it's just what you learned growing up, Trevor. And I can't fault you for that.
That's fair. I just love the fact that I'm a biochemist who can't pronounce any of the chemical names at all.
But if you were in Canada, people would be like, this guy's spot on.
Oh, thank you. So you're saying everybody in Canada has a speech impediment?
Join the conversation at forums.fasttalklabs.com or tweet at us with @FastTalkLabs. Head to fasttalklabs.com to get access to our endurance sports knowledge base, coach continuing education, as well as our in-person and remote athlete services. For Trevor Connor, I'm Rob Pickels. Thanks for listening.